This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is writer Victoria Bennett, author of All My Wild Mothers, Motherhood, Loss and an Apothecary Garden. The book weaves memoir and herbal folklore and is a story of rewilding our wastelands and the transformation that can happen when we do. Daisy for resilience, dandelion for strength against adversity, borage to bring hope in dark and difficult times. I begin by asking Victoria about how the book came about, and in particular, why she chose to structure it in the way she did.
The book was written over 10 years, so it was a slow-growing book, and it was written as and when I had time to write it in between the care demands that I had in my life at the time. But the plants, the structure of the plants came about later, partly because the conversation that I was having with the garden as the book was growing. The book grew at the same speed as the garden. So it started out with nothing, and over 10 years, the pieces of writing built up to be a whole piece. And the garden grew with it, and the plants that are in the book are in the garden, or were in the garden. So as I was writing and planting and discovering plants, they started having a conversation between maybe the properties or the folklore of the plant and a memory or an experience that I was having in planting the garden or in growing the garden with my son. And so this natural conversation started between the plants and the memoir. And then as I started to look more deeply into things like the folklore and the properties, it seemed that there was also a conversation to be had between the kind of the symbolism and the history and the folklore of a plant and the memories and the story that was being told in All My Wild Mothers.
So actually thinking about that, All My Wild Mothers, obviously the title, obviously you refer to people throughout the book who fulfill that role, but is it also the plants that you're referring to?
Yeah. It is about motherhood in terms of it being my own journey of motherhood, my relationship as a daughter to a mother, and as you say, to the people, particularly the women in my life who nurtured me and raised me and have supported me also as an adult. But it's also about the Mother Earth and mothering the earth, nurturing the earth, but also being mothered by the plants. So yes, it's that kind of relationship that we have with nature that's in there as well.
You very much built a healing garden, and I think you referred to it as an apothecary garden. And I wondered if you could just talk about what that is.
The tradition, I suppose, of an apothecary garden is like the old physic garden, where the plants were grown for culinary and medicinal use. So for me, an apothecary garden would be traditionally the plants within it would all have a medicinal, a healing purpose. So it wasn't initially intentional to grow an apothecary garden. The impulse was just to try and grow something in this broken ground that we had. But as I started to look at what properties the plants had and try and find out more about them, because these were largely just the weeds that were growing around us in the building site where the housing estate was being built. But we wanted to find out, I was finding out these things with my son to learn more about these plants. And it became obvious to me that all the plants around us have this either direct healing, the medicinal healing property to them, or have a history and a relationship with a sort of a more abstract sense of healing. So often the folklore talks about sort of healing melancholy or whatever, and then it might have a medicinal property of a sort of antidepressant. So this is, for me, that's what an apothecary garden is. It's something where the plants are bringing both practical healing and nourishment, but also the space in itself is a healing space.
I thought I knew quite a bit about plants and sort of medicinal uses because I'm no forager, but I'm interested in that kind of aspect of horticulture, but there were such a lot of uses for the plants that we take for granted or that are just so commonplace that I learned such a lot from your book. You obviously said you went on a learning journey and learned how the garden could heal and how the plants could heal. And I wondered how you did acquire that knowledge, because you obviously do have a lot of it now. Did you pick it up along the way, or, was it received from others? How did you learn about your garden?
I mean, not a gardener in the sense that I always sort of imagine, I think possibly because of the kind of gardening magazines and stuff, I sort of imagine a gardener as being somebody who knows everything about where to put plants and where they grow and all the rest of it. I still don't know those things. I still don't know really when to prune and where to plant. But I've always grown up around, well, my mother gardened. She did declare that she wasn't a gardener. It's very much kind of throw it in and see what grew. But also my sisters were all involved with various different aspects of sort of either environmental protection, or my eldest sister was actually a gardener. And so she taught me a lot. And then friends and members of my group, the Wild Women, have also given me knowledge. So I've kind of acquired knowledge through conversations in a kind of the old-fashioned way of learning. And then I've added to that with research that I did with my son in terms of looking up plants in books and finding out about them, and then following that up as I was structuring and writing the book as a whole with deeper research. And I also studied on the plant medicine course at Dilston Physic Garden. So it's sort of a combination, and then some of it is instinctive. I wouldn't say sort of to use plants in that sense purely on instinct, but I would maybe be attracted to a plant and then want to find out why, whether there was something with that plant. So one of my daily practices was to go into the garden and just kind of more intuitively choose plants to work with during the day, where I'd make a kind of what I call a daily brew. So a hot infusion, and work with those. But then I would so I'd be physically working with the plants, but then also looking at what they represented, what their flower language was, what their folklore is, what their medicinal properties, and kind of piece these things together and see why I might have chosen those. But also look at the relationship of the plant with the ground as well. So what could it bring to the soil that it was growing into the ground it was growing in, and also how would they relate to each other and support each other. So sort of that's the way I've done it.
So taking a sort of step back, I suppose, you did, as you say, build the garden with your son, and you both learned from it and grew in it and with it. So I wondered what it was like when you first acquired it. Was there a garden there to start with?
The house was a new build social housing estate, which so we moved into that, and it was built over a former industrial site. So it'd been a contemporary industrial site, but it'd also been an industrial stoneworks for, I think, 200 years. So it'd always been used for industrial purposes. Each house had a garden at the back, and that was pretty much, as we discovered, several feet of rubble on top of rock, and then a thin layer of topsoil, and then a sort of monospecies lawn grass sown on top. So it had an area, but it wasn't a garden as such. There wasn't anything growing in it.
So, you built the garden on I think it's fair to say, limited budget, and with, like you said, with limited knowledge. It was a learning curve, and you sounded like you did, again, a really ecologically, environmentally responsible way of building a garden, in as much as you took your time and you did repurpose stuff. You just did it slowly, slow gardening. But I think that you may have experienced some pushback from various places. Can you just mention about some of the struggles that you had when you were trying to evolve the garden?
One of the things we experienced very early on was we, realizing that we had very little soil, we thought, okay, well, we need to grow the soil before anything else, because part of the garden was also to feed us. So we needed to grow beds that would feed us. So we looked around the building site, and what we could find was some old pallets that had been left behind by builders. They weren't being used, so we repurposed those and made a compost heap. But we very quickly received a letter saying that we needed to remove the rubbish from our garden within 7 days, or eviction proceedings would take place. Bearing in mind we were a family with a young and medically dependent child as well in this house. So that was my first realization that how I saw things wasn't necessarily seen the same way. So I went through this process of explaining that it wasn't rubbish, it was repurposing and recycling. So that kind of realizing that the way that I saw the garden wasn't necessarily the way that other people saw the garden. So there are a lot of with social housing, I would always state before any of this, it's vital, it's so important that it's there, and it provided us with a home at one of the most difficult points in our lives. But like often with rental properties, it comes with a lot of bureaucracy. And one of the things that came with it was a desire for things to be the same rather than different. So what we were doing was something different. It was something against the norm. For example, at the front of the houses, everybody had a little patch of grass, and all the rest of it was mown very beautifully, but very short. And ours grew wild. So by the end of 10 years, we had a proper sort of mini meadow in front of our house. Growing wild when you're in those kind of situations, in a rental situation, can, as we found, present the threat of losing your home. So it's not as simple as, oh, well, you go out and you rewild your garden, or you grow all your weeds. You know, not everybody can do that without risking their home. So I think what my son and I tried to do, rather than feeling angry, was we tried to give opportunities to show people what we were doing. So we would always put the garden up for the village open gardens, and my son would show people around and explain what the plants were doing and why our garden was as it was. And we talked to people about what we were doing. But, you know, like anything, difference can be met with welcome, and it can be met with rejection. So it wasn't easy, and it did show us in many ways that we would struggle to live in the way that we wanted to live within that space. But we did.
Yeah. So, you know, you mentioned your mother gardening, and the fact that I think she was quite a carefree gardener, really. And as you say, just, you know, let things evolve and develop. And I wondered, do you think that her gardening style, and particularly her gardening aesthetic, influenced how you built your own garden?
Oh, yeah. Definitely. I mean, I think I grew up in a space where a garden was a place of magic and kind of mystery and wildness, and my mother was constantly, maybe I shouldn't admit this, she would, you know, she was walking past a wall and she saw something that she thought was interesting, she'd be sort of, you know, she had a little penknife that she kept in her pocket, and she would just dig it out. I'm like, that belongs to someone else. You know, and sort of weeds, or, you know, what people would call weeds growing on the side, she'd be like, pick them up and gather the seeds and stuff. So I definitely grew up with that aesthetic. And also she was an artist. So I grew up with an aesthetic of the art that she liked as well around us. But, you know, it also meant that I grew up looking at gardens in the books of, you know, I grew up looking at Charleston and Sissinghurst and all of these places. And those places in my head that I thought I might live one day, I imagined that I would have this beautiful cottage garden and you know, the sort of the whitewashed cottage and stuff, and then life wasn't like that. Life didn't turn out that way. But I think what we got in the end was something far more expressive of where we were.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's still, even with Charleston and Sissinghurst, there's still a looseness to all that formality. So there is a style that does lend itself to the wild and to medicinal plants, I think. Thinking about the medicinal plants as well, they guided you through really tricky times. But were there any plants that you found were particularly useful that you've grown over the years?
I think one of my favourite that I use a lot is borage, or I prefer its common name of starflower, which I really like. And that's something that it has a lot of emotional properties. So it's a really good support, but it's also, now at my particular point in time, it's quite good for kind of menopausal symptoms. So that's one for me that's kind of a whole plant. It's aesthetically healing, if that makes sense. I find it a very beautiful plant. It provides medicine, and it's also more emotionally resonant. Sort of root is to sort of heal what's wounded, heal what's broken. So I use that a lot. And it's also a great one for pollinators in the garden. So it's kind of an all-round brilliant plant. And another of my favourite, which is on the front cover of the book, is, of course, the dandelion, which is pretty much a powerhouse of a plant. You can use every part of it. It's good for the earth, it's good for the insects, and it's sort of has so many medicinal properties, from sort of cleansing and fortifying, but it's also representative of kind of the sort of the duality of what life really, which is kind of grief and loss, but also transformation and new life. So you've got this kind of wonderful life cycle of the dandelion that represents to me that kind of resilience and, like I said, the duality that we go through in life, where we have deep grief, we have loss, but we have the brightness of joy, which like the dandelion represents when it appears in early spring. And also it grows anywhere. So
that was what I was going to ask you. So we've had the dandelion debate at the Chelsea Flower Show this year, where I think Alan Titchmarsh said it's not a garden if it's got dandelions. And, obviously lots of gardens have dandelions in, but not every garden cultivates them deliberately. So if you wanted to plant, say, like a dandelion, would you have purposely sown that there, or would you just allow your medicinal plants to kind of pop up as and when and where they basically put themselves?
Well, in our case, we did deliberately plant a dandelion, the same as we deliberately planted a nettle patch. In fact, that was one of the first plants that went into the garden at my son's instruction. My son was 4 at the time, or 4.5 and a bit, as he insisted on saying to everybody. But, so he would choose the plants as well. So a young child has no preconceived ideas of what is a weed and what is a beautiful flower. So they're all treasures, aren't they? So I think that you can plant dandelions. You can also wait. I mean, we also, over the period of 10 years, plants would arrive. Some arrived because we were literally disturbing the soil. So once we were digging down and down, other plants started to arrive in time as those dormant seeds sort of came back to life. But if you don't want them to spread everywhere, then you can stop them from seeding. You can take the flower heads off before they seed. You can grow them in a pot if you want. I'm not entirely sure whether any plant just defines a garden as not being a garden.
Yeah, no, I don't get it. It's a big debate, that one, but if you wanted to have dandelions in your garden and you wanted to plant them, then absolutely, and it's a garden, in that respect. So it's good to know that you did deliberately plant stuff that other people would be maybe wary of putting in. And like you say, guided by your son. I loved his influence in the garden, and I wondered, how are you now gardening together? Have you got any new gardening adventures on the horizon, or are you involved in any?
Well, one of the things that happened late last year is we actually moved from our house in November. So sadly, the garden doesn't exist anymore, because that is one of the prerequisites of the housing, was that we destroyed the garden when we left. So that was a process of undoing everything that we had done, although I like to think it was November, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of those things are going to come back.
I hope so.
But we moved, and we moved into our first ever owned house. I'm 51. I never thought it would happen. We moved to Orkney, which is a very different place. So we moved into a house near the sea. It doesn't face the sea, which helps. It has a very small backyard, and we've been growing that. There wasn't anything in there. The difference being that it had deep, deep, deep soil, and I'd obviously received a lot of nurturing a long time ago, but then it had been sort of left for many years, not been nurtured. So we've been seeding and growing in that and creating a very small apothecary garden, partly through plants that we brought with us from the garden, little cuttings and little plug plants, and also through seeds that we've been given.
I'm assuming you've not looked backwards since you've moved up there, because it sounds idyllic.
Yeah, I mean, it was really hard leaving the garden, but I hadn't realised how much of a stress it was, feeling different all the time and feeling like what we were doing to express our lives was seen in this kind of very negative way. I hadn't really taken into consideration how much that felt difficult. But yeah, it's lovely. And also people still regard wild gardening as neglect. You know, it's not seen as deliberate. It's seen as, oh, you're not bothering. So, well, it's not bothering. Actually, it took a lot. But the lovely thing is that once you do all of that stuff and you reintegrate and you reintegrate a sort of a really biodiverse working habitat or ecosystem, then you can step back. And it worked perfectly for me, because as I have chronic illness caused by some genetic conditions, and as they got worse, it was great because the garden was doing a lot of the heavy lifting, because it was, nature was working with itself rather than against itself. People go on about gardening being so hard, and it's like, it can get easier if you work with the natural world rather than against it.
Thank you to Victoria for writing a powerful memoir around the framework of a healing garden in some difficult circumstances, and for sharing the experience with us. And thanks to you, as always, for listening. Dr. Ian Bedford is here now, talking about something very important to me, as I've just had one of my own structural shrubs completely shredded in the past week or so.
The relative ease of importing goods from almost anywhere in the world nowadays ensures that many different exotic or seasonal flowers, fruits and veg are readily available for us to buy throughout the year, such as strawberries from the Iberian Peninsula, green beans from Africa, or cut flowers from South America. Importing plants and produce from foreign lands, though, does, however, create an opportunity for certain notoriously invasive non-native species to enter Britain. Whether these be plants, animals, or diseases, they'll all be of concern to us, since their appearance could risk new problems for not only our crops, but our native biodiversity and our gardens too. But Britain has been experiencing invasions from non-native species for hundreds of years, and it's demonstrated that the problems they cause are rarely long-lasting. Either the invader can't survive through a British winter, or, as it spreads and becomes more numerous, native predators begin accepting it as an abundant new food source and begin naturally controlling it. Then, over time, the invader may become just another resident species within Britain's biodiversity, joining a long list of others that include red lily beetle, western flower thrips, and spotted winged fruit flies. But knowing that doesn't lessen the importance of trying to prevent other invasive species from entering Britain by checking plants and produce at our borders. However, it's inevitable that some will always get through. And one that succeeded, which is still very much in its rampant stage, is a medium-sized moth, distinguished by its white wings with iridescent brown borders. The box tree moth. Originating from East Asia and first discovered in Kent during 2007 on imported box trees. The box tree moth is a serious pest of Buxus species, where its green, black and yellow striped larvae cause defoliation and dieback as they feed amongst a mat of webbing they spin around themselves. Having rapidly spread across much of Britain, we now know that it copes well with our climate, and that once established on a box tree, it's very well protected within its webbing from predation and pesticides. However, we also know that box moth now has a problem, which relates to the fact that its larvae only feed on Buxus. Since here in Britain, the overwhelming majority of Buxus is grown in gardens. Gardens where Buxus hedges and topiary are steadily being killed by box moth infestations and are being replaced with alternatives such as you.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.